And welcome to the X Zone, everyone. I am Rob McConnell. For the next 4 hours, I am your host. I'm your guide as together we cross the time-space continuum to this place that I call the X Zone. It's a place where people dare to believe and dare to be heard. It's a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. And we come to you Monday through Friday from 10 p.m. Eastern until 2 a.m. Eastern, right here on the X Zone Broadcast Network, the X Zone TV channel, and, of course, our broadcast affiliates, including SimulTV, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Talkstar Radio Network, and that's just a few. And, of course, our main broadcast network, XZBN, the X Zone Broadcast Network. To find out all about the programming we have available for you, 7/24/365, visit www.xzbn.net. And for the programming on the X Zone TV channel, visit www.simultv.com. Before I get to my guest this hour, I'd just like to thank all the many cable and other providers that the X Zone TV channel is on around the world, thanks to our good friends at SimulTV. And I just have the listing of where we are seen around the world, and I'd like to share that with you. United States, Bangladesh, Europe, France, Japan, Jamaica, United Kingdom, Australia, Africa, and in Africa, Kenya, Nigeria in the U.S., South Africa, Tanzania, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Turkey, Southeast Asia, including China, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Korea, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Taiwan, Thailand, Vietnam. And then, of course, other countries like Bahrain, KSA, Lebanon, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, India, South Korea, and throughout Australia. That's just some of the stations, and according to our good friends at SimulTV, thanks to their partners, OONA, Stir MX, Tata, MNC, Global Telecom, the marine industries that carry the X Zone and SimulTV channels on their cruise ships, Comcast, 500 to 1,500 hotels throughout Europe. The number, and I had to take a second look at this when I got this, and I said, "You guys are kidding." And they said, "No, these are the confirmed numbers." Are you ready for this, X Zone Nation? 211,436,972 people view the X Zone TV show through our different affiliates. So thank you so much, each and every one of you, for making this a journey of a lifetime. We started this ship, this quest, this journey over 30 years ago, and that was with one station. And thanks to you, the interest in the paranormal, as well as all the great guests we get on this show, we are where we are today, and the sky is the limit. Speaking about guests, we've had this gentleman on the show before. His name is Eddie Upnick. And Eddie, welcome back, and congratulations on book number 7.
Thank you, Rob. It's been a grind, but it's been enjoyable at the same time.
Yeah. Eddie, for our listeners who did not have the pleasure of hearing you with us when you were back on with us, I believe it was 2016, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, in the 70s, I was a joke writer for Rodney Dangerfield, and I also did some ghostwriting for sitcoms in the 70s and 80s. And I started writing these books after I met Sidney Dowse in 1994 in Antigua on vacation. He was an MI-6 agent who told me stories about World War II that weren't in any history book. And his stories, I talked to him for about 40 hours over the course of 7 days. And those stories, he told me, are in every one of my 7 books. I mixed in fact with some fiction and was able to come up with a storyline that I think Sidney would be proud of.
Where did your first book start with? What part of this amazing story that you have shared with us over the years, what was the very first book about, and how did you start off this book that has lasted, this story that has now lasted into 7 books?
Well, in Antigua, my wife and I were there, and Sidney was there with his wife, and we were sitting opposite of each other at a sandals resort. And his wife says, "Oh, Sidney, he's one of the men that escaped from Sagan, the prison camp they made that movie about, The Great Escape."
Right.
And I was always a big fan of The Great Escape. And I started asking Sidney all kinds of questions.
Mm-hmm.
And he was telling me things about the movie that were not too well known. And as we progressed, he was later telling me that, before he was shot down, he worked for MI-6 when the war broke out. And the reason he was shot down is he was one of the few people who worked for MI-6 that actually could fly an airplane. And Britain needed pilots desperately. So he was on a reconnaissance mission over France when he was shot down. And that's how he became one of the prisoners in the Great Escape movie. He was one of the tunnel kings. He said, like the Charles Bronson character in the movie, if anyone remembers the 1963 classic.
One of the greatest movies ever made.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah.
It was, and one of the things he told me that very few people know is that none of the Americans actually escaped in reality, because 2 days before the breakout, all the Americans were put into one barracks, and that barracks happened to be furthest away from where the tunnel was built, so they couldn't get out. But of course, for Hollywood, you had to have Steve McQueen and James Garner get out and steal an airplane and a motorcycle and, make it a little more exciting.
Sure. I remember there being talk. I remember there being talk that Hogan's Hero was actually based on The Great Escape.
Some of that and some of Stalag 17.
Right.
I think the sergeant in Stalag 17 was Schultz, and they used that one in Hogan's Heroes too.
Right.
That name. But anyway, with Sidney, he after we had our initial drinks, and he was talking about the Great Escape and how he got out of there. Later in the week, he started to open up to me because he had no children, and he said, Eddie, I got some stories here that really should be told. I have no children. Somebody's got to hear this, and I guess I was easy to talk to. And he started telling me stories about the beginning of the war and something that happened at British Command headquarters that had everybody turning their heads. He said the two men came into British Command headquarters in July of 1939, and they were carrying some form of handheld devices. And they said, "We're here to help you defeat the Germans, and we have an advanced technology we'd like to use to improve your radar system." And then he helped break the Enigma codes for them. And these two men were there a total of maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and they were pushing buttons and somehow interfacing with the systems that the British had. And as these two men were leaving, Stuart Menzies, who was the head of MI6, he said to these guys, "Well, who are you guys?" And he said, "Well, we're here to make sure a certain future doesn't happen." And they said, "Well, aren't you German defectors?" He says, "No, we're not German defectors. We're here to make sure a certain future doesn't happen." And then they just left. And that story gave me goosebumps, and it triggered the whole writing of this series. So, this was the beginning of it. And then Sidney started to tell me stories about, also, one other thing I left out, the men who were leaving handed a note to one of the men at the door and said, "Make sure you get these 19 names and kill all of them. They're German spies working at MI6. And sure enough, Stuart Menzies looked up the names, followed them in on the list for 2 weeks, and he realized they were German spies, and they were all shot. So it was a fascinating story, and I believed him. I have no proof other than his telling me these stories. But he went on with me about Churchill and Joseph Kennedy, and stories are just not in any history book. He was talking about Churchill in particular, and he said they broke the Japanese code in late November of 1941.
All right, we're going to take our first break here. Please stand by, Eddie. A fascinating story. X-Zone Eddie Upnick is our guest, and if you'd like to find out more about Eddie Upnick, his website is www.eddieupnick.com. That's EDDIEUPNICK.com. XZTV.com. And Eddie and I will be back on the other side of this break as we continue here in the X Zone from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Don't forget the X Chronicles newspaper for May-June 2019 is available with our compliments at www.xchroniclesnewspaper.com. Exonation Eddie Upnick is our guest of this hour. His website, eddieupnick.com. Now, Eddie, in the previous segment, we were talking about these men who seemed to come out of nowhere, went to British intelligence, helped them with information that I don't know where they got it from, and they also gave a list of Russians or German spies that had actually infiltrated the system. The MI-6 followed these men, and they were found to be double agents, so to speak, and they were executed. So, Eddie, who were the men who came with that information who nobody knew who they were?
Well, that was a question that Sidney told me they hadn't really understood. I mean, Sidney said, Menzies suspected they might have come, back in time or something like that.
Right.
But he never really went into it until after the war was over in 1955. Menzies and Sidney were having a drink in a bar in London, and Menzies opened up to Sidney and said, "So those two guys, man, they had to be time travelers. There's nothing else they could have been. But I don't want to say that publicly because they'll all think I'm nuts." And that was kind of the way it went. And that really was the key story to triggering the writing of these books, particularly book number 1, Time Will Tell,
right,
which is a story of a dystopian future where the Nazis won World War II, and 4 scientists go back in time to try to change history.
Now, did these time travelers, to the best of your knowledge, based on the conversations that you had with Sidney, did they also supply the other allies with information?
Not to my knowledge. It was just that, 1939, July of 39. They were there for a total of 15 or 20 minutes, and that was it.
Why did Sidney think that these men, these time travelers, went and helped the British and not any other allies?
He was a pretty straightforward guy. I mean, he wasn't one to, hyperbole about time travel or anything else that he viewed as out there.
Right.
He just sort of reported to me, what Menzies thought. And he said we couldn't refute the information. He said when the two men said they weren't Nazi defectors,
right, then,
well, who could they have been? That was an interesting part of this whole scenario. And, if there ever were time travelers, if there ever was a chance, World War II would have been a pivotal time in our history where maybe some of these guys would have shown up to help one side or the other.
But if they were time travelers, why didn't they show up during World War I to prevent World War II?
I cannot answer that question.
I just thought I'd put it on the table. Now, what did Winston Churchill know about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in November of 1941?
Well, this was one of the most interesting stories among many in the 40 hours that I interviewed Sidney. He said that in late November of 41, the British broke the Japanese code. And they saw that on December 7th, they were planning to attack Pearl Harbor. And they also saw in this note that if 3 of the 4 aircraft carriers that the United States had stationed at Pearl Harbor were destroyed during the sneak attack, then Japan would have invaded Hawaii. That was the plan. So Churchill was thinking about this for a couple of days, according to Sidney, and came up with a compromise plan where he called Roosevelt, and he just said, listen, get your 4 aircraft carriers out of Pearl Harbor between December 1st and December 14th. And Roosevelt asked him why. He said, don't ask any questions, just do it. And they did it. They sent all 4 aircraft carriers out on maneuvers. So when the Japanese attacked at dawn on December 7th, they sunk a battleship or 2, but none of the aircraft carriers were there. So Japan didn't invade Hawaii. And history, might have changed on that dime as well if the British hadn't broken that code. I mean, so many key pivotal things happened at the beginning of World War II that could have changed history.
Now, I understand there was a connection between Adolf Hitler and Joseph Kennedy.
Yep, that was another one of the great stories Sidney told me, that Joseph Kennedy was filmed by the British intelligence. In fact, Sidney was involved in this directly. He was one of the MI-6 agents that followed Joseph Kennedy into Germany in the late 1930s. And they saw Joseph Kennedy signing an agreement with Adolf Hitler. And they wanted to know what was in that agreement. And apparently it was brought back to London, and Joseph Kennedy was the ambassador from the United States, staying in London and the Court of St. James. And Sidney said, okay, how do we handle this? So Churchill said, I'll invite Joseph Kennedy for dinner. And while he's here, you break into the American embassy. They somehow got the code to the safe. And they said, you film the document, put it back in the safe, and bring it to me. And I'll keep him here long enough until you tell me, you've got it. So this is what they did. Joseph Kennedy waited for, when Joseph Kennedy left and was having dinner with Churchill, they broke in to the American embassy and photocopied this, or made a picture of this document. And what the document said when they got back to Churchill was, when Germany wins World War II, Joseph Kennedy was going to be his top lieutenant in the United States. So Churchill, Sidney was looking at me, he says, you wouldn't believe what Churchill said. He said, he turned to him and said, there's going to be a curse on this family for this man signing the deal with the devil. And then to think about what happened to the Kennedy children.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. That one had me taking a step backwards.
Now, speaking about history, Neville Chamberlain was always looked at as the fool. But was he really the fool that history has painted him out to be?
Sidney said he wasn't. Sidney said he was trying to buy time for England to build weapons, build more ships, build more bombs. So he played the fool and he played up to Hitler. But he said he really got a bad rap in history. That he wasn't, really as stupid as they made him out to be, that he thought peace in our time with Adolf Hitler was possible. So that's how he put it. One last story about Joseph Kennedy. After they found out about this note, they knew that Joseph Kennedy was being tipped off by the Germans anytime there was a bombing run on England. So the MI-6 watched him closely. So anytime he left England and went north into the hills, they knew the Germans were sending their bombers.
But weren't the bomber? But wasn't England getting bombed every night?
At this point, it was not always London that was being bombed. They were going after airfields, but they always knew when London was the target.
I see.
Joseph Kennedy was leaving town. They sent up their fighter planes, and they used them for counterintelligence. And Sidney said, we shot down a whole bunch of bombers thanks to Joseph Kennedy, even though he didn't know it, because, when he left town, they sent the fighter planes up to shoot down the German bombers.
Another thing that really interested me was apparently, when was this? German submarine U-505 surrendered without a fight off the coast of Africa. What's the story behind that?
Well, this was a story I haven't Sidney told me about this, and tonight, I haven't really discussed this with you in the past when I was on the show, but this was pretty fascinating, and I put two and two together once that show Hunting Hitler came out on the History Channel.
Right.
Where the CIA was looking into, who escaped at the end of the war. Did Hitler get out? Did he get to Argentina?
Mm-hmm.
And basically, this U-505, someone tipped off the Americans off the coast of Africa that there was a U-boat heading for Argentina. And 3 destroyers went to the target coordinates, and this German sub didn't even fire a shot. They just came up and surrendered. It's the only time a ship was surrendered intact, the German submarine U-505. There was one German crewman who was killed by radiation sickness. And when they went in, they found U-271, uranium, which they were taking to Argentina. So apparently this was near the end of the war, so the Germans were planning a Fourth Reich in Argentina, and they were trying to take their nuclear fissile materials over there so they can, start up again in Argentina, because Juan Perón, who was the head of Argentina, was a Hitler sympathizer, and, they were going to build it all up again.
Whoa, Craig, that was kind of loud, my friend. You got the point across to us. All right, it's time for our break. And fascinating story. We're going to be speaking more about Sidney Dowse and the information that he was able to share with our guest this hour, Eddie Upnick. If you'd like to find out more about Eddie, his website is www.eddieupnick.com. And Eddie and I will be back on the other side of this break as we continue here in the X Zone from our broadcast center and studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. I'm Rob McConnell. Don't go away. And X Zone Nation, welcome back. This is the X Zone radio show, TV show with yours truly, Rob McConnell. We're coming to you from our broadcast center and studios in beautiful Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Now, before I get back to Eddie Upnick, who is our guest this hour, www.eddieupnick.com. Just like to remind you about some of the other great programming we have available for you 24/7, 365 on the X Zone Broadcast Network at www.xzbn.net. You have Know the Name, Know the Genius in You with our host, Sharon Lynn Wyeth. And then you have Connecting with Coincidence with Dr. Bernie Beitman, MD. A Different Perspective with Kevin Randall. Paranormal Stakeout with Larry Lawson. Heart to Heart with Dan and Angela Clark. Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiecka. Excuse me. And Cal's Corner with Cal Korf. And they're just some of the shows that we have available for you at xzbn.net. Eddie Upton is our Upnick. Why did I call you Eddie Upton? Who's Eddie Upton? I have
there's an Upton who's a baseball player.
Well, all right. No offense meant there, my friend. Eddie Upnick is our guest. And once again, his website is www.eddieupnick.com. Besides that, it's Friday. It's been a long week.
It's a beautiful day.
It is a beautiful day. Mind you, every day is beautiful when you wake up on this side of the grass. So we were talking before the news break about the U-505 and some other events, but it seems that Argentina plays a major role in post-World War II Germany as they saw it as if they were the victors, or was this also their plan if they lost?
Well, Sidney was telling me stories that was confirmed, like I said before, about
Right.
this Hunting Hitler series that was on the History Channel.
Yeah.
That in the mid-1930s, the Germans were buying all the land that they could on hilltops and very inaccessible places in Argentina. And this was their plan, that if they lost the war, this was where they were going to escape to, because Juan Perón would protect them, and they had pillboxes everywhere. And you know, when Sidney was telling me this, I was just sort of listening to it, you know, not believing it 100%, but when I saw the Hunting Hitler story, I thought, whoa, you know, this adds up to exactly what he was talking about. And he said 250 high-ranking Nazis, possibly including Hitler, escaped to Argentina via seaplanes and submarines leaving out of Norway. And they had tunnels underneath Berlin that led to all these different airfields. And it just sort of, you know, was very interesting to me that this was possible, that he actually got out. And he said that once these 250 Germans got to Argentina, they were left alone by the United States, even though our intelligence services knew they were there. And Truman made a decision. He had his advisors come to him, and they said, listen, we know these 250 Nazis are in Argentina, but we don't want to make it public. If we make it public, then the Russians are going to send 20,000 troops to Argentina. And this was the beginning of the Cold War, and they didn't want the Russians to have a foothold in our hemisphere. So they decided it was better to let 250 aging Nazis live out their lives in Argentina than have 20,000 Russian troops looking for them and then staying in Argentina and creating missile bases or whatever they might be doing after that. So that was more.
Well, based on what you were told by Dowse, who may have been told this by, given the information by Menzies, was Hitler killed in the bunker in Germany, or was he alive and brought to Argentina?
Sidney didn't know. He was sort of agnostic about that, but he said it's very possible because Mengele got out, Bormann got out. A lot of the top Nazis were definitely escaped to Argentina. Among many of them were never found. And there was some pictures there was a picture of Hitler. He said that where he looked like he was 55 years old, 60 years old. There was a medicine. He had ulcers, apparently. Adolf Hitler had ulcers, and it was a specific medicine that he took while he was in Berlin.
Right.
And they found empty bottles of this medicine in the jungles of Argentina. So, you know, they said it's possible that he did get out.
Was there anything that Menzies discussed with Dowse that sent chills up Dowse's back?
Well, I mean, the 1955 story in the bar that, you know, Menzies thought these two men were time travelers.
Yeah.
That was the most goosebump story that he'd heard. And certainly when Sidney told me that was my goosebump moment. And it was, you know, just so many of these stories are just not in any history book. And unfortunately, they don't really teach history anymore in colleges. So a lot of this stuff gets lost.
How did you authenticate the stories that you were told to by Dowse if they weren't in history books?
Well, I don't have any proof of it. I just have his stories and my belief in him telling me these stories, because, like, his wife kept saying to me, he doesn't talk to people about the war. He never talks to anyone. And it's very surprising that after 4 days of your prodding him, he's finally opened up and he's talking about this. And like I said earlier, he said he didn't have any children, and he wanted to get these stories out. He didn't want them to die with him.
Were you able to vet the fact that Dowse himself was in fact a member of military intelligence, MI-6?
Yes. In fact, there was a video. He was a very wealthy man. His family was wealthy, and he did a video on, I think, the 50th anniversary of the escape from Sagan,
Right.
the prison camp where everyone who was still alive came to this thing. And, you know, in the video, they were talking about all these other people that worked for MI5 or MI6 along with Sidney.
But did they mention Sidney's name?
Well, I mean, it was narrated by Sidney.
Oh, okay, but
So-
that all right now. But once again, how do you know for a fact that Sidney was in fact a member of MI6? You know, to narrate a video and not be part of the content, but putting yourself into that scenario would be very easy to do. But was there any way of background checking with military intelligence, the armed services in Great Britain, that he in fact was a member of the military or military intelligence?
Well, you're right. I didn't check with the military,
Okay.
but I just trusted him when he told me these stories. I believed him because I said, you have no reason not to tell me. You know, he was, when he started telling me the stories, he just said, you know, I was working at my desk at MI6, and everybody was leaving me alone, and then they said, we need pilots. And he raised his hand. He said, yeah, I'm a pilot. And then they threw him on an airplane, and he got shot down.
Wow.
So, I mean, it doesn't seem like he was exaggerating what happened at that moment.
Right.
But
right.
you're right, Rob. I mean, I didn't research him, you know, his MI6 history maybe as much as I should have.
The story must have been very compelling for you at that point when you were taking everything that Sidney was telling you as verbatim.
Well, I'm very good at reading people.
Yeah.
You know, I've always been that way, and,
Right.
and you know, I can usually tell when somebody's BSing me about something, and I just didn't get that feeling at all when I
Gotcha.
was talking to this man. I mean, it was, you know, my wife was saying, you know, this guy sounds like the real deal. You know, and yeah, he is.
During the time he was talking to you about his involvement in World War II and as being a part of military intelligence MI6, was his wife there as well?
His wife was, no, the conversations I had were
Yeah.
just with him,
I see.
aside from when we were having dinner together, the four of us.
And when the four of you were having dinner, did he talk about MI6 and what he did in the war?
No,
No.
never.
Okay. I
He didn't talk about it in front of the women.
Why not?
I guess he's old school.
Ah.
He was before the Me Too movement, I guess.
All right, you and I have to take our final break. Exo Nation, our guest this hour is Eddie Upnick. His website is www.eddieupnick.com. And don't forget some of the great shows we have available for you on the X Zone Broadcast Network. The radio part, that is. Know the Name with Shronlyn Wyeth. Connecting with Coincidence with Dr. Bernie Beitman, M.D. A Different Perspective with Kevin Randall. PSO, or Paranormal Stakeout, with Larry Lawson. Heart to Heart with Dan and Angela Clark. Too Good to Be True with Justina and Peter Marsh. Mission Evolution with Willowiecka, and Cal's Corner with Cal Korf. This is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell, and Eddie Upnick and I will be back on the other side of this short break as we wrap up this hour. Wrap up this week. No, we still have a couple of more guests to do, Craig, but you're right, this is Friday, and Friday also always goes so fast. So to each and every one of you listening, because a few of you will not be joining us when we come back from the top of the hour, have a very safe weekend. And as I always say to you when you're leaving, always keep your eyes to the sky and your heart to the light. This is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell. Eddie Upnick and I return on the other side of this break. Don't go away. And welcome back, everyone. This is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell. Eddie Upnick is our guest this hour, www.eddieupnick.com. Eddie, I understand that the Russian consulate contacted you back in 2012. What was that about?
Well, my second book at that time was Future Tense.
Yeah.
And I dropped a copy of the book off. I live in New York, so I dropped a copy of the book off at the Russian consulate. And I circled the page where Putin was killed in 2017 by his own bodyguard. I have no idea why I did this. I must have been had a couple of beers or something and thought this would be good publicity. So I dropped it off. About 3 weeks later, I get a phone call. Somebody calls me up and he says, "I'd like to speak to Eddie Upnick, please." So immediately I got the impression this was the consulate calling me. And he says to me, "Eddie, I got this book, where you circled that Putin is shot by his bodyguard in 2017. We would like to know who is going to shoot him." And I just said, it's 2011. It's 6 years from now. It's a fictional book. I don't know who's going to shoot him. Yes, I know it's fiction, but fiction is based on fact, is it not? I said, yeah, sometimes. He said, so who's going to kill him? And I just couldn't get this guy off the phone. He just thought I knew who was going to shoot him. And so I just eventually, got him off the phone, and I was looking around for black SUVs following me, but never happened. I thought that was pretty comical that they thought I knew who was going to shoot Putin 6 years later.
Well, that would be the same reply or response that the U.S. Secret Service would follow with protocol if somebody dropped a book off at the American embassy saying that somebody was going to shoot the president 6 years from now, too. They'd take it very serious.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I was looking for publicity or a good story, but I realized afterwards I probably shouldn't have done it.
Well, hindsight is 20/20, right?
Yeah, I figured I'd give it a shot, and if it got to Putin, maybe I could get an interview with him or something. That would have been worth it.
I don't think he goes to the gulags in Russia, so.
Which is where I might be.
Yes.
If that went through.
Especially if they took you to be very serious. Listen, December the 11th, 1941. What is so significant about that date?
Well, according to Winston Churchill, that was the key date of World War II. And nobody really quotes that date anymore. Because after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor 4 days earlier on December 7th, Churchill was expecting the United States to declare war on Germany as well as Japan. But we didn't. We only declared war on Japan.
Well, that's because Germany didn't attack Pearl Harbor.
Right, but Churchill was hoping the United States would get into both wars, and, because Britain really needed our help at that point. And he was panicking for 4 days. And then on December 11th, Hitler declared war on the United States.
Right.
And that, put a big smile on Churchill's face, because now the United States could get involved in the European war.
Well, the United States was inadvertently involved because the United States was supplying the British Isles and European allies with food and other things in the giant convoys that were crossing the Atlantic.
That's true. They were given 20 destroyers in the Lend-Lease were given, but at the same time they wanted a million American troops coming over too. And that couldn't happen until Hitler declared war on the United States on December 11th.
Thinking about the possibility about these time travelers, do you think that time travel has influenced the future?
Well, maybe it's influenced the past, not the future. I don't know.
Well, if something happens in, let's say somebody comes from the future and they make the changes in the past, doesn't that affect the entire time-space continuum?
Well, it's interesting you asked that question, because in the 7th book that I just finished, it's basically a story of alternate realities. and the 7 protagonists in the book are asked to go back in time to try to destroy the most deadly ship of all time in space that killed 78 trillion people in 100 different planets. So if they're successful, then even their own histories would be changed.
Right.
As well as all these other planets that were destroyed that are now not destroyed. So I have thought about that. There's no way to really answer it one way or the other, but you can certainly think about it.
Okay, so
Rod Sterling certainly did.
Let's just give it a little bit of thought here. If somebody from the future comes to the past to change an event of such magnitude as the event that we were just talking about, he wouldn't exist. Or she wouldn't exist. They wouldn't exist. Because this time-space continuum had been altered. So how could they actually come from the future to the past if their future doesn't exist?
Well, in my stories, I have a supreme being that is helping, that gives all of them a time chip in their DNA, which allows them to remember both timelines.
Prior to meeting Sidney Dowse, were you interested in time travel and in the possibility of the future and the past coexisting at the same time in alternate realities?
Well, I did grow up with the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits and One Step Beyond, and I was definitely a sci-fi kid. Those things entered my mind when I was 10 years old, and they sort of stayed with me. And that went into Star Trek. So.
Oh, that was a great TV show.
Absolutely.
Are there any pictures anywhere of Sidney Dowse?
I think online. If someone Googles him, they'll show pictures of Sidney, maybe even from the 50th anniversary. Very good-looking man, gray-haired. He passed away in 2009.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, well, he asked me not to write about the stories he told me until after he passed away. So I started writing Time Will Tell in 2009. And it was released in 2010, and so
Why do you think he didn't want you to write about him until he was dead?
He told me he didn't want to answer reporters' questions.
So
that was part of the reason he said, just make sure, you don't write about this until I'm gone, because I don't want to have to sit here and answer questions of reporters.
Could it be that he did not want to be asked questions by reporters because they could actually prove or disprove anything he said?
Well, that's always a possibility, but like I said before, I trusted him. I didn't think he was making stories up to impress, I didn't see him as an egotist, he just wasn't that way. He was very laid back, and I had to pull this information out of him. Took me 5 days of talking to him before he really opened up about, the good stories of Churchill and time travel and all that.
So what's next with you? Are you going to be writing a book 8?
Well, we'll see how this one goes. As I said, there was someone at HBO that was interested in the series, and of course, he was his demise happened. He was fired, so. We'll have to find someone else to pick up on it. But I think this 7-book series would make a great series on Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, the Sci-Fi Channel. I mean, it could run 10 years because it's the story of the time traveler's family covering 150 years of time.
All right, Eddie, I want to thank you so much for joining us. And Exo Nation, if you'd like to find out more about Eddie Upnick, visit his website, EddieUpnick.com. All right, let's take a look at this. Let's do a little bit of a reality check here. You've got great stories, but they can't be authenticated. You've got somebody telling you stories who claims to have been a member of MI-6, who the author has never vetted. So we don't know if any of this information that we heard about over the last hour is true. Did Churchill really say what he was supposed to say? And the fact that Eddie brought his book to the Russian consulate or the Russian embassy, circling the fact that in 2017, Putin would be assassinated by somebody close. That would raise flags with anybody, the Secret Service. And why would somebody really do that? To me, that seems like a very sensationalistic act. And if this is the action of the author, then that puts, in my opinion, the credibility of anything, especially the credibility of Sidney Dowse or even his very existence. I'm Ron McConnell. We'll be back on the other side of this break. After all, this is the X Zone Broadcast Network, where we search for answers, but we demand the truth. We'll be back. Don't go away.